from Ecclesiastes chapter 7. And if you hear some strange noises during the presentation, for some reason the microphone has started to act up. I have no idea why, but I stepped up to the podium about 15 minutes ago and it sounded like a war had broken out. And it's happened a couple of times since, so just hold tight to your pew and you should get through it okay. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. That's verses 1 through 6 of Ecclesiastes 7. There are a series of maxims, statements, that at first reading at least appear to be somewhat difficult to comprehend, at least from my perspective. But we are looking at this book from the perspective of one who does not have God in his life, contrasted with one who comes to understand that no life can be fully lived and meaningful without God. And so every text that we deal with, we need to deal with from those two perspectives. So the question that I raise here in these first 6 verses is essentially, what in the world is he talking about? If I were using a worksheet, which I sometimes do and sometimes don't, I would ask, in the first 6 verses, the author contrasts wisdom and folly. So we're going to list each of these contrasts and explain their meaning. The first one is not all that difficult, but as we go through the list, in my judgment, it's a little more challenging, but not impossible to comprehend. First, a good name, and a good name represents one's reputation, and one's reputation is based on his or her character. A good name is better than costly perfume. I think of costly perfume, I immediately think, because I'm a student of the New Testament, of Mary's anointing of the feet of Jesus with the costly ointment valued at approximately 300 denarii, given that a denarii or denarius was the wage for one day's work. The perfume that she used was valued at 300 times a normal day's wage. So you think of that in contrast to what you make today. If you're making a sacrifice like Mary's, take your daily salary, multiply it by 300, and you have an idea of what she was doing. That's a lot of money invested in something like that, and yet this writer would say that a good name, and a good name again is from our reputation, which is derived from our character, is essentially priceless, well beyond the value of the most costly perfume. And the point is, there are things that money cannot buy. Another day of life. Doesn't matter how much you have, when it comes time to die, you can't buy your way out of it. Good health. It can buy you health care, but it can't buy you good health. And I'm sure you could easily add to the list. I think about houses and homes. Money will buy you a good house, but it has relatively little to do with a good home. So they're often things of far more value than the expensive things that only really impact the external. And I think of Proverbs 22:1 here, where Solomon, who is the author of Ecclesiastes, writes that a good name is to be more desired than great wealth, and loving favor, or favor, is better than silver and gold. So that's the point that he's making with this first contrast. There are some things that are priceless, and those are the things that we ought to value, but often people do just the opposite. They value the things that don't have real eternal significance and ignore the things that truly do matter. And it seems to me a really good way to begin this section by acknowledging that people have their priorities misplaced. And we have to work hard not to let that happen. The second thing that he says is that a day of death is better than the day of birth. That's again from verse 1. He saw death as the conclusion to a life well lived, as he makes this statement. If you have lived a long, productive life, death holds something appealing to you. And I've experienced this firsthand numerous times as I've sat by the bedside of people who were nearing the end, and family are in tears, and they're just, if they're able to communicate it at all, saying, I just can't wait to get it over with and to move on. And I know people will say, oh, you don't mean that, but if you're looking at life and death from a Christian perspective, it makes perfect sense. And this seems to me to be what Solomon is saying here. At birth, nothing has been accomplished, no reputation established. We just show up, so to speak. In contrast, a righteous person can look back over a good life and see death as the victorious conclusion of that life. For those of you who were here, was it last Sunday night, when we dealt with 2 Timothy 4, Paul's final words? He said, I fought a good fight, I finished the race, I've kept the faith, and henceforth there is laid up for me a crown. And he says this is not just for him. He says it's for all those who love the appearing or the coming of Christ. What is on the other side from the Christian's perspective is far better than anything we leave behind. And I think Solomon is at least hinting at that in this contrast between the day of birth and the day of death. It is better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. And again, that doesn't at first glance seem to make a lot of sense. Death is the end for all. The living go to the funeral. They contemplate life and death. Those celebrating, that is feasting, may get the sense that life is trivial. And I believe that he's saying, in essence, that in times of tragedy, when we're mourning the loss of others, we're reminded of our own mortality, and perhaps we'll give a little more thought to our own soul and our eternal well-being. Whereas at the house of feasting, little thought of eternal things. In fact, little thought of matters that really matter will occur, because people often are so focused on eating and drinking and all that goes with that kind of activity that they have little regard for spiritual issues. And so in that sense, the house of mourning is preferred to the house of feasting. Sorrow is better than laughter. And again, it doesn't seem on the surface to make a lot of sense, but a sad face is good for the heart. Adversity is thus a good teacher. We learn more from the difficulties we encounter than from the things that just come easy and seem natural. And I believe that's what Solomon is communicating here. A person's face may reflect sadness, but he can still be happy on the inside in his heart. And so you can experience sorrow, but that sorrow will be tempered by the realization that there are better things ahead. I think that 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18 describes a situation where this particular analogy holds true. He's writing to the saints at Thessalonica who have questions about the second coming of Christ and what will actually occur if you die before it happens, or if you're alive when it happens. How will that impact you personally? And he says that for Christians, death is sorrowful, but we sorrow not as others which have no hope. And then he described the situation when Christ returns. If we died prior to his return, we will be raised. And if we are alive, we will be changed. And together we meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. And concludes verse 18, wherefore comfort one another with these words. So even in the midst of sadness and sorrow, from a Christian perspective, or from one, as we look at Ecclesiastes, who's living life under the sun with a realization that there's more to life than what we experience under the sun, that there is also a spiritual and eternal realm. Even times of great difficulty can be valued, and we will learn from them and be made better because of them. It seems to me in turn that that's what James was saying in James 1 when he said, count it all a joy when you face various trials, because the trying of your faith develops patience. The heart of the wise is a house of mourning, while the heart of the fool is a house of mirth. Verse 4. A wise person allows death to provoke thought and meditation, recognizing that death comes to all. On the other hand, the fool doesn't want to think about death because their minds are fixed on pleasure. So you think about what he has said in the context here, and I think it makes perfect sense again. At least those who understand at death that there is not only loss, but there is real hope, will derive something from the process that the fool will never experience. And it's because he chooses to be a fool. And I think I need to stop for a moment and tell you that fools are fools because they choose to be fools. We're not talking about fools in the context of people who are mentally challenged or deficient. We're talking about people who make a conscious choice to live life in a certain way, focusing primarily on themselves and this world and the things that bring pleasure. But a wise man realizes that sometimes the difficulties actually are for our best, in that there are more important things than pleasure. There is responsibility and obligation and duty that the fool never sees. The fool doesn't understand the value of simple work. He would rather, she would rather, if you please, simply sit back and do nothing than prepare for the future. And of course, there's nothing in Scripture that would discourage us from preparing for what lies ahead. We just make our preparation with the knowledge that the Lord is in control. We're not. So think about the fool in that context. We're not talking about people that lack an ability to understand and properly apply God's Word. We're talking about people who just choose to disregard everything that's spiritual and eternal and live for the moment and live for themselves. It's better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man than the songs of fools. And I have to tell you up front that this one hits home with me. I don't like to be told I'm wrong. Sad reality is I am sometimes. And I'm willing to admit it, but I'm also willing to admit I don't like to admit it. I don't like to be told that I've made a mistake. And I make them all the time. But I learn from them. And that seems to me to be what Solomon is saying. You're going to be rebuked. How you respond to that rebuke depends on whether you're a wise man or a fool. A wise man will listen, and he will learn. A fool will completely disregard what he's heard, often will get angry, and in fact will even go on the offensive, when he should just listen and take away from the rebuke of the wise something helpful and beneficial. Men have a tendency to avoid people, wise men, who would confront, that is, rebuke them, preferring the company of fools who offer little or nothing of real value. And I see this in political circles. People tend to surround themselves with folks that are going to agree with them. They don't like when they're in positions of power to have someone tell them you're wrong. And I've observed this personally without regard to party. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, they're all the same when it comes to being told you're wrong. They don't want to hear it, and yet Solomon is essentially saying if you're really wise, you'll surround yourself with people who will be honest and truthful with you, who will tell you you're wrong when you're wrong. And that's a sign of wisdom on your part as well. When you just get yes men to confirm everything you think and believe, you're being foolish, and there will be a price to be paid. Crackling thorns under a pot are like the laughter of fools. Crackling thorns appear more than once in Scripture, and always they have a negative connotation. These crackling thorns are good for one thing and only one thing, to be burned. But they make a lot of noise when they're thrown on the fire. They're generally very dry, and when the heat is applied and they begin to burn, you hear it. And everyone 3,000 years ago, when Ecclesiastes was written, would have understood that immediately, because nobody had natural gas or propane or coal. Everyone heated with wood or manure. Dried manure has been a staple of many cultures for a fuel source for century upon century. And so they would sit around fires. It's how they warmed themselves. It's how they cooked their food. It's how they made their sacrifices. And so they'd know what he's talking about when he talks about crackling thorns. And he says that fools are like these crackling thorns. They make a lot of noise, but they offer little of real value. These thorns also burn very quickly. And so they don't provide a good source of heat, but they also don't provide any other service that's useful. So the best thing you could do is throw them on the fire and listen to the noise. Fools are a lot like that. So his analogy makes perfect sense. Verse 7 and 8. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Now, many of the things that we've encountered in Ecclesiastes thus far in our study, do have political overtones in relationship to a monarchy and how the subjects should view their king. In fact, some of the things he says about wise men taking advice and fools ignoring it are in the context of a ruler or king. So it's not surprising that he would revert to something similar again in these two verses. What is attributed to each of the following? Oppression. Causes wise men to get upset when there's someone taking advantage of others. It's not good when citizens suspect that those in power will use their power to oppress others. Did you get that from verses 7 and 8 when we read it a moment ago? That's what he's trying to communicate. We're contrasting wise and foolish rulers, wise and foolish people. And one of the things that occurs is that wise people cannot sit back and do nothing when they see folks being oppressed for no reason at all. When you witness others being taken advantage of, you ought to step in and do what you can to right the wrong. Furthermore, a gift, he's talking here about a bribe, has a corrupting influence. One who offers or receives reveals something wrong deep inside his heart. If you offer a bribe, that's an indication that something's not right in your heart. And if you accept the bribe, the same is true. Remember when Paul was under arrest in Caesarea, and Felix and Drusilla heard him preach of righteousness and temperance and judgment to come? And Felix trembled and said, "When I have a more convenient season, I'll call for you." He never did. I think he called on Paul often. That is, he visited him, but he never showed any indication that he would respond to Paul's message from the gospel. But he continued to rule for 2 full years until Festus came on the scene, and Paul was kept in prison that whole time. And the record tells us in chapter 24, it's because Felix thought that Paul might bribe his way out of jail. He'd seen that Paul had influential friends. They came to visit. He clearly had access to resources, and he thought, maybe, just maybe, I can make a buck. If I keep him in here long enough, he'll bribe his way out. And I am confident Paul could have raised the money, aren't you? But it never came into that good man's heart to do such a thing, because offering a bribe is just as bad as taking a bribe, and Paul would have no part of such a thing. So the NIV here says, extortion turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. That's what we've learned thus far. And then that which is better, seeing something to its completion, is better than witnessing its beginning. A spirit that is patient is better than a haughty attitude. And one of the reasons why seeing something to its completion is better than witnessing its beginning is because often many things that are begun are never completed. And the real joy and the sense of satisfaction comes not so much in starting something as finishing it and then being able to look at what has been accomplished. And that makes perfect sense in that regard. And that seems to be at the heart of those 2 verses. Then in verse 9, be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the bosom of fools. Now, I want to stop and tell you, just after I take my sip, that anger itself is not sinful. I assume you all know that. Don't you get angry from time to time? I don't think there's a day that passes that something doesn't anger me a little bit. One of the reasons I quit watching news is that it just made me so angry. Mr. Klein is not here yet, but if he were here, he would tell you that he yells at his TV. Well, I just choose not to watch it. He would be here, but Wilma can't sit for 2 hours. His mother. So if you've been wondering where Greg is, he's not forsaking Bible class, but so his mama can come. They'll be here in about 15 or 20 minutes. Don't you let her know I mentioned her. You can tell Greg I mentioned him, though. That's fine. I told him last week, I try not to let a single service go by when I don't talk about you in some way. But I digress. Anger is just a part of life. I get really angry, not just watching news, but I get really angry on the highway. I have to really watch myself. Things happen that make me angry, but you can't do anything about it. I told you Thursday I had to do this funeral at the last moment to help a family out. I agreed to do it. No good turn goes unpunished. I get out and somebody backs into my car. Well, I looked at it, didn't see any problems, so I just let them drive away, and I got back to the building and realized it wasn't quite as good as I thought it was. But it's just a car. But I was a little angry that they just didn't look. But I was more angry at myself because I didn't look better. But I didn't get upset. I didn't obviously use vulgar, profane language or jump the young man's case for not paying attention. It can happen to anybody. But I'd be a liar if I didn't say it angered me a little bit. Being angry is okay. It's what you do when the anger comes. And in, I think it's Ephesians 4:26, Paul wrote, "Be angry and sin not." So don't associate anger with sin, because sometimes anger is the direct result of wanting righteousness over unrighteousness and upholding good over evil. If you're not angered by some of the things that are going on in our society today, I'm not quite sure why that is. I get angry every time I hear a feminist declare how proud she is to have had an abortion and how she feels no guilt over it at all. I murdered a baby, but it doesn't bother me in the least. And then half of society applauds her for her courage. And I see nothing courageous. It just really angers me, so I need to move on. Why is there a call to be slow to anger here? Anger lodges deeply. It resides, the text says, within the personality, the bosom of those who, by their quick tempers, show themselves to be fools. God commands us not to sin in our anger. Can you think of an occasion when Jesus was angry? He saw them in the temple exchanging money and selling sacrifices, and knew that they were cheating people who had come there solely to worship God, and they were being taken advantage of it. He overturned the tables of the money changers and drove them out of the temple. There was nothing sinful in his action, because they had made the house of prayer a den of thieves, and he was clearing out the den. We call that righteous indignation. And he did nothing sinful there. But he manifested his anger at those that would so abuse people who sincerely just wanted to worship God. And if you wonder why that was the case, it wasn't that they were providing animals and exchanging money. It was that they were doing so at inflated prices. The law required that every animal sacrifice was to be perfect. You could call from your herd or flock the perfect lamb and bring it there to sacrifice, and it would be rejected. But then they would say, that's okay, we have acceptable sacrifices that we will be happy to sell you. But they always sold them at inflated prices. And they would only accept certain coins into the treasury of the temple. If you traveled, as many did, from distant places, and you brought the coinage from your particular geographic area, they would say, sorry, that's not acceptable, but we're happy to exchange this unacceptable coinage for what would be acceptable. But there's a fee, and it was steep, and Jesus put a stop to it. But what happened when Jesus left? They were right back at it again, and that's why in John's gospel it occurred early in his ministry, and in Matthew, Mark, and Luke it occurred in the final week of his ministry. It's not that the writers got confused. It happened twice, and we would expect that as soon as Jesus is out of town, that those same people would be right there in the temple taking advantage of sincere worshipers. And Jesus wouldn't tolerate it. I think that fits in very well with what he said, by the way, in the first 8 verses. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. We would not refer to the former days in this language. We would call them the good old days. And I hear people routinely talk about the good old days. Did you ever ask what were people talking about in the good old days? The good old days. We always remember things generally better than they actually were. And that's okay. But Solomon is saying, stop living in the past because the past is the past. Take advantage of the present. And guess what? When you do that, the future will be much brighter. But if you're constantly living in the past or daydreaming about the future, you miss out on the present, and the present's really all we have. So wise men don't sit around constantly longing for the good old days, because that's exactly what folks were doing in the good old days. We tend to remember things as better than they actually were and forget about how good it is for nearly all of us right now. So the question should not be asked, and I'm asking you, do you think that it's true? Don't ask, why were the good old days better than the present? That really serves almost no purpose at all for the present. To live in the past shows, I think Solomon is saying, an absence of wisdom. Those who are constantly thinking about what used to be are unable to deal adequately and in a positive way with the present, what is taking place now. Michael A. Eaton said, one cannot face the difficulties of one age by pining for another. Now you think about that. Just reflecting on the past and longing to return to the good old days does absolutely nothing of a positive nature for the present. And what we need to be dealing with is the present and how to correct things that need corrected, how to fix what is broken, how to make things better. And you can't do that if all you're thinking about is the good old days. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. And of course, wisdom has been a major topic. If you've been with us from the beginning of this study, he's had a lot to say, and we'll still have a lot to say about this issue before we are done. Wisdom provides what advantages then to the wise according to this text, 11 and 12 of chapter 7. The wise man may not have material wealth. Wise men are not necessarily wealthy. And yet, those who are wealthy may not have common sense, which the wise man will have. An inheritance, Solomon says, is a good thing when the one who inherits has wisdom. Wisdom is protection, just as money is. A wealthy man can afford to protect himself by building a fortress or hiring guards, but a man without resources must use wisdom and common sense to stay in safe places out of harm's way. Therefore, knowledge coupled with wisdom is a greater advantage than wealth. Now, I think it's really important for us to take special note of this. Knowledge and wisdom is more valuable to us than wealth. Most people think wealth is the answer to every problem. And the reality is that it often just makes problems worse. I can think of a lot of ways in which our war on poverty that started under Johnson, and I believe was intended to accomplish good things and was motivated from a desire to help people, really didn't do that. We started providing funds to support unwed children, mothers who have children out of wedlock. You have a baby, the government will provide you so much money to support that baby. Well, that seems all well and good and wonderfully intended, but what happened is that mothers just started having more babies to get more money. And it's a vicious cycle. You may not like to hear this, but that's what happened. It was out of good motives, thinking that money can solve everything, and it doesn't. In our welfare system, yeah, people who can't work need to be supported. But what happens is that people that can work decide they don't want to work. We're to the point now where we have folks actually advocating that we just provide everybody an income, a universal income, whether they do anything productive or not. I am not opposed to helping people who can't work or can't find work. But that solution that is being suggested now just encourages laziness. I don't think I've got a hard heart. I don't think I'm uncompassionate. I just believe that you get more bad outcomes than good outcomes when you start throwing money at things. And that seems to me to be a perfectly accurate way to describe what Solomon is saying in verses 11 and 12. What we need is people who are educated and motivated to stand on their own 2 feet. Now I'll get a little political here and tell you it has never been, from the beginning, the intent of government to care for us from cradle to grave. We keep demanding more and more from government, but guess who pays for it? Well, we ultimately will, and by we I mean our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. You cannot just pull money out of thin air forever. It will come back to bite us eventually. We'd be far better off if we just all learned to live within our means, starting at the top in Washington and in Columbus and in Charleston, and follow it up in the home. We'd all be better off. But just throw money at it. What we need is knowledge and wisdom. That'll help us more than all the money in the world. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. Well, some of that I read and immediately it makes perfect sense to me. And some of it, well, here again, I got to think for a while. What should man consider and why? Well, we should consider the work of God, his creation. Consider us as individuals made in his image. He says when God has bent something, man cannot straighten it. Go back to 1:15, and he talks about the crooked, that God makes crooked, can't be straightened. God in his omniscience, that's his knowing everything, and in his omnipotence, that is his possession of all power, has created a world perfectly suited to his designs. However, man frequently inflates his own worth and intellect and thinks he can undo what God has established. But no one has the ability to loosen what God has bound or to bind what God has loosed. The future is unknown, so be happy in the moment. That's what he's saying. Now, how do we give that some application? Well, if you're a Bible student, you believe that God created, God sustains, and he rules the universe even now, what he has ordained will occur. We can't stop it. We just think we can. We think we're in charge and we have all this power when the reality is the power lies with God. Now let me bring this home in a way that many people find offensive. I don't get all hot and bothered over climate change and global warming and what man is doing to our planet, because man is not in charge. God is. And that's what Solomon is saying in this text. We think we are, but we aren't. We think we have all this power, but the power resides in heaven. Maybe, just maybe, if God had come into our world as he did in the days of Nebuchadnezzar and sent a few of our rulers out to live like animals for a little while, we get back to our senses. But since he doesn't operate that way anymore, and we have the written word, we need to hear and heed it. And the simple matter of the fact is that God is in charge. And what God has ordained is going to happen. And as I think just in the last few weeks spoke to you about God's precious promises, I reminded you that he has said, as long as the earth remains, seed time and harvest, day and night, winter and summer shall not cease. And by the way, I haven't heard a lot in the last couple of weeks about global warming. Have you? Wonder why that is. Does climate change? Well, absolutely. This winter is a lot different than last winter. I wouldn't expect it to be any other way. I was born 6 months after the big snow, which occurred in November of 1950. Well, I guess it was 7 or 8 months now that I think about it. I grew up hearing about the big snow and thinking, boy, I'd like to see one. Well, here I am 70, I still haven't seen one. That 8 inches we got last, was it last Sunday night, a week ago? That wasn't a big snow. A lot bigger than we've been getting for a while, but who knows? And if you look at the weather forecasters, they're only people in the world who can be wrong at least half the time, sometimes more, and still keep their jobs. And they want to tell me what's going to happen 12 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. I'm just going to stick with God as long as the earth stands. It will snow when God wants it to snow and rain when he wants it to rain, and it'll be dry, and there will be hurricanes, and there will be tornadoes, and just everything that has always been weather will be weather, and it will be as unpredictable as it has ever been because we don't know what God has in store. And we don't need to know if we know him. So I heard that bell, John. I assume that means it's time to quit. So we will pick it up next week in chapter 7, verses 15 through 18. I looked down there and that 7 looked like a 2 without my glasses. Did I hit the wrong button? But next week, God willing, we'll start with verse 15 of chapter 7 and continue to look at what Solomon has to say as he contrasts wisdom and folly, wise men and fools, and how that impacts our lives and our relationships with others from the highest official in government all the way down to the lowliest citizen. You have an opportunity now to visit for a few minutes, and then we'll begin our morning worship at 10 a.m.